Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to speak about the shocking removal of the Saudi-led coalition from the UN blacklist for the children in conflicts regarding killing the children in Yemen. Our panelists tonight are Sam Walton, Andrew Smith, and Simon Henderson. Thank you all for joining us on this informative panel.
Thank you.
I will just start by giving just a brief historical background for the UN role, and then I leave the microphone to my guests tonight. UN and their working bodies in Yemen were completely incapable of protecting the Yemeni children of the war crimes committed by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen. Actually, their role was some kind of a negative role because they were unable to protect the children from either from being killed in this war or from being a target for the uh, Saudi coalition or Saudi-led coalition uh, planes. In 25th October 2016, the Committee on the Rights of Child (CRC) noted that in its report noted that there are trusted and credible information that Saudi Arabia are committing blatant violations to the rights of the children during their military operations in Yemen. They also urged Saudi Arabia in that report to fulfill its commitments and to respect children's rights and the international humanitarian law regarding the children in armed conflicts. In June 2016, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, he listed the coalition or the Saudi-led coalition on the UN's blacklist for the countries that violate children's rights in conflict zones, according to a report issued by the United Nations regarding the violations of children's rights in Yemen. In that report, the United Nations listed that they had confirmed the killing and they had confirmed that there were more than 1,300 children victims of the Saudi led coalition operations in Yemen. More than half of these children were victims of bombing in of bombs thrown by the coalition on residential neighborhoods, on schools, on other places that, like, some children were just playing in front of their houses or were just going to their schools as all of the children around the world do every day. These children were a target of the coalition, and many of them didn't return home on these days. A few days later, Ban Ki-moon did say that Saudi Arabia tried to pressure him to remove its name from the blacklist, either by threatening to stop the funding to most of the United Nations bodies across the world. In 2017, the United Nations did remove the Saudi-led coalition from their blacklist, and they moved Saudi Arabia to the criteria B, and that this criteria was responsible for protecting children from being killed during the military operations. Later, or earlier this year, on the 15th of June 2020, in the annual report, the current UN Secretary General did also remove Saudi Arabia from the blacklist of children in conflicts. They said that the number of the children killed in Yemen did decrease significantly, and that there were only 222 children killed in 2019. It seems that this number didn't didn't fulfill the UN's criteria for Saudi Arabia to be listed as committing war crimes in Yemen. Some of the crimes that are committed in Yemen are killing the children or injuring them, using the children in the armed conflicts as like playing a role in the armed conflicts, even sexual violations, targeting the schools or the hospitals, and stopping all the humanitarian aid, especially vaccines, immunizations, medications, and even the children formula that's needed that's needed to be used inside Yemen that's needed for the children there to have a healthy and normal childhood. I leave now the microphone for Sam Walton to continue from there.
Thank you. I'm not an expert on the situation at the UN, but we're very lucky to have Andrew and Simon, who really do have a lot more technical expertise with us today. I'm a campaigner, I'm an activist, and I'm going to tell you a bit about some of my encounters with the Saudi regime. And I think that's very illustrative to what is happening at the UN. So, Fatma just raised how in 2016, the Saudis essentially threatened the UN with defunding because they didn't want to be on the UN blacklist for killing children. And I think this is a great example of how Saudis interact with human rights, how the Saudi regime interacts with human rights. It doesn't interact on there's a problem with our human rights, there's a problem with us killing children, we must improve the human rights situation, we must stop killing children. It interacts with this in a way so the Saudi regime interacts with human rights and UN bodies with they're calling us names, so we're going to threaten them. And that's almost certainly what's happened to get Saudi removed from this blacklist. And one of my experiences to show the way the Saudis do this is that the Saudi regime does this is they try and influence powers at the UN to lobby on their behalf, and they threaten and they bribe. I think a good example of this is the case of Major General Ahmed Asiri. As people in Yemen know, he's one of the main Saudi architects of the war in Yemen. In 2017, when he was in London, I placed him under citizen's arrest. This made the Saudi regime so angry that the then Foreign Secretary, our now Prime Minister in Britain, Boris Johnson, called Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and apologised. Why did he apologise? Well, that became clear 2 days later when Theresa May, our then Prime Minister, flew out to Saudi Arabia and attempted to sell them 48 more Eurofighter Typhoons. These planes cost about $1 billion, and it's clear that the British regime, from the Foreign Secretary to the Prime Minister, was more interested in selling weapons to Saudi Arabia than it was in anything to do with human rights. Let's fast forward to 2018, when Khashoggi was killed. Unfortunately for Ahmed Asiri, the Major General is not a member of the Saudi royal family, and he's been made a scapegoat for the killing of Khashoggi. 3 weeks ago, the UK put him on a blacklist for human rights violations for the killing of Khashoggi. But he's the only Saudi figure on there. He's there because the Saudis have used him as a scapegoat. The UK is happy to stand up for human rights, but only with the permission of Saudi Arabia. The day after he was put on this blacklist, the UK decided to restart new arms sales to Saudi Arabia. So that's how little we care about the war in Yemen in the UK. We care primarily about, what the Saudi regime thinks. And the UK decided to restart these arms sales despite a court ruling to stop these arms sales, which I'm sure Andrew will tell you more about in a bit. The theme from the UK government throughout is that it's not about stopping the Saudis killing children. Time and time again, we see the UK government's priority is selling weapons, and they are willing, like the US and other Western Saudi allies, to ignore Saudi's crimes against children in order to sell more weapons and to have influence with Saudi Arabia. Unfortunately, that's how the UN works. When we're talking about killing children, though, it's not just Saudi Arabia. The Houthis are equally guilty here, but it's a lot easier to track people. It's a lot easier to track the killing of children when you're not dropping a bomb from 10,000 feet. And the UN certainly has shown almost a greater appetite to look at Houthi crimes than Saudi crimes. Whilst we're talking about the killing of children, we're not talking about, I'm sure Simon will touch on, the children that have died because of famine, the children that have died because of lack of medical supplies. It's not simply the children that are killed directly by a Saudi bomb or a Saudi bullet. And certainly the deliberate Saudi-led blockade has resulted in tens, if not hundreds of thousands of deaths of children in Yemen because of the lack of food and medicine. And then there's damage to infrastructure, etc. This removal from the UN blacklist, though, is farcical, and we are completely complicit in it. But let's remember we're having this conversation, and the conversation being had around the world about this removal from the UN blacklist is not, is the Saudi regime involved in the killing of children? That no one's debating that. The question is, how much of a mass murderer of children is Saudi Arabia? And the fact that we're debating that question and not are they or are they not really tells you everything you need to know and tells you just how farcical it is a decision. The decision is to remove Saudi Arabia from the UN blacklist. Right, I'll hand it back to you, Fatima.
Thank you, Sam. Andrew, can you please start your intervention?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak to you today. We stand in solidarity and support with the people of Yemen who have been under the most ferocious bombardment for the last 5 years, and we want to see a way forward, because wherever there is war and conflict, there will always be arms dealers and arms companies trying to cash in from it. Every single bullet which is fired, every missile which is fired, every bomb that is dropped, every fighter jet that is flown has been produced somewhere by a company to generate profit. This hasn't just created war crimes and atrocities, it has prolonged war, it has enabled war, it has fueled war, and it is civilians who are paying the terrible price of this. And the war in Yemen is no exception. It has been made possible by billions of pounds worth of arms sales. It's been made possible by the complicity and support of governments, including the UK government, where I'm speaking from, and including the US government. If we look at the words of an arms company employee who told Channel 4, if we weren't fair, in 7 to 14 days there wouldn't be a jet in the sky. And I think that sums up exactly the role which these companies have played and the roles which these governments which have enabled these sales have displayed. And since the war began, schools have been destroyed, hospitals have been destroyed, homes have been destroyed, millions of people have been displaced, tens of thousands of people have been killed, vital infrastructure has been destroyed, funerals have been bombed, weddings and family gatherings have been turned into massacres. And despite every single atrocity, every single abuse, that hasn't been enough to shift the government's position. We're always told about how rigorous and robust arms export controls supposedly are, but the reality is nothing could be further from the truth, because while this war has created tragedy upon tragedy for the people of Yemen, it has been a major business opportunity, been popping out the corks and the champagne the longer that this terrible war has gone on. And they've known they've been able to do so with the full hypocritical support of governments like the UK. We don't just believe these arms sales are immoral. We know that they're also illegal. Arms export criteria and duty export criteria is very clear. It says that if there is a clear risk that a weapon might be used in a serious violation of international humanitarian law, then an arms sale should not go ahead. Now, since this brutal war began, Saudi forces have been routinely accused of the most serious possible breaches of international humanitarian law, and yet that hasn't been enough. Governments have always found an excuse to look the other way. We brought this campaign against arms trade, we brought a case to the High Court. We were arguing these arms sales are not just money. This was held up by the Court of Appeal last year. It was a landmark verdict, and it worked. In the 6 months which followed, the value of new UK arms licenses to Saudi Arabia and the other countries involved in the coalition fell by 99%. That shows the value which this court judgment can have. Unfortunately, the government has effectively overturned the verdict. Earlier this month, it announced that it was actually going to be resuming sales. They said they'd finished doing their review into the legality of previous sales and concluded that they were fine. They'd concluded that no laws were broken. They said they accepted that there were potential war crimes, but they described these as isolated incidents. Now, these aren't isolated incidents. These are people's lives we're talking about. When they look at the bombing of a hospital, they'll call that an isolated incident. When they look at the bombing of a school, they will call that an isolated incident. We believe this decision is completely wrong, and we're looking at all options which are available to challenge it as well. Because what this shows is not just the horrendous impact that the Saudi bombardment has had on the people of Yemen, it also highlights the role which the Saudi state can have in lobbying in the UK as well, and in actually directly changing UK foreign policy in a way which is horribly negative for people in Saudi Arabia and terribly negative for people in Yemen. It's had devastating consequences by propping up one of the most brutal and repressive dictatorships in the world. And that lobbying power is also what we've seen at the United Nations. I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever, because if creating the worst humanitarian crisis in the world is not enough to get you blacklisted, then what more would it take? How much worse would the situation have to get in order for there to be serious, meaningful consequences? And if these arms sales stand, then the message which it will send to the dictatorship and to the other despots and dictatorships in the Saudi-led coalition is one of complete support. The message it sends to them is that what they are doing is legitimate, what they're doing is backed by the US, what will only prolong the war and prolong the agony. The message which it sends to people in Yemen is a very different one. The message it sends to them is that their rights don't matter, that their lives don't matter. The message it sends to them is that what happens to them is of less importance and less consequences than profits for arms companies like BAE Systems. And that's why we'll be fighting this latest decision of the way. That's why we will be working with people across the world to challenge ridiculous, absurd, dangerous, counterproductive decisions like the one which we saw to remove Saudi Arabia from the blacklist, because for far too long this dictatorship has used its power, frankly used its oil as a negotiating chip to ask others to look the other way. And for far too long it has worked, and the consequences have been brutal and deadly. And ultimately, when we're talking about politics, we are talking about consequences. There are sides to this, and we stand full square with the peace campaigners. We stand full square with the people of Yemen who want this terrible war to end, who want a political solution. Unfortunately, our government has made clear that it is standing with the arms dealers, it is standing with the dictatorships, it is standing with the inflicted 5 years of brutal bombardment on the people of Yemen. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andrew, for giving us this informative speech. Simon, can you please start your speech?
Thank you very much, Fatima, and thank you to Sam and Andrew for your excellent presentations, and thank you for the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights for inviting me to speak today. My name is Simon Henderson. I'm Head of Policy at Save the Children Australia and an international human rights lawyer. In my role at Save the Children, I'm responsible for our international policy and domestic policy work, and one of our priority areas is the humanitarian crisis in Yemen and the protection of children. Today, I'll be speaking about the crisis in Yemen and its effect on children, the UN Conflict Against Children report, and how Save the Children has responded, before going on to three topic areas where we're calling for greater responses by the international community. So I'll speak to defence exports transparency, Magnitsky Act sanctions, and also pledging and support for the humanitarian response. I will give some additional attention on the Australian dynamics of how the Australian government should respond, but I'll also talk about the contextual response and how Save the Children internationally is responding. So in terms of the current developments in Yemen, as you would all be aware, Yemen continues to be the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now. Nearly 80% of the population, 24 million, are in need of humanitarian aid, and this includes 11.3 million children. 18 million people across the country are food insecure, including 8.4 million who are suffering from extreme hunger. It's estimated that 100 children are dying every single day. For over 5 years, armed conflict has been the main driver of food insecurity. The collapsing economy, import restrictions, and ongoing insecurity are driving food prices up, proving devastating for a population that heavily relies on imports for its staple foods. Acute malnutrition remains a serious concern for households in the worst affected areas, and this is having a devastating impact upon children. A recent UNICEF report released just last month found that more than 4.3 million children are in direct danger from death, injury, or attacks, or forced to be part of the fighting. There have consistently been cases where international humanitarian law has been breached during the conflict by the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition. This includes attacks where we're breaching the 6 grave violations against children in time of war, which includes killing and maiming of children, recruitment and use of children by armed groups, attacks on schools or hospitals, and abduction of children. Since March 2015, the UN has verified that 3,153 children have been killed and over 5,000 have been injured, and that number is likely much higher. A total of 219 schools have been attacked over the last 5 years and 142 hospitals. During the last 5 years since the conflict escalated, the UN has verified that 441 children have been abducted, 435 of which are boys. Save the Children is particularly concerned about the use of explosive weapons in highly populated areas. Airstrikes have been responsible for the highest proportion of direct civilian casualties. According to the Yemen Data Project, in the first 6 months of this year, there was a 139% increase in bombing rates by the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition compared to the last 6 months of 2019. Just 2 weeks ago, an airstrike in Al Jawf governorate killed 9 people, including 4 children, while a few days prior, another air raid killed 6 children. In 2018 and again in 2019, the UN found that the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition committed numerous violations of international humanitarian law, including likely war crimes. And this coalition is responsible for the vast majority of civilian casualties, including children. Yet despite these shocking statistics, in June, the UN Secretary General removed Saudi Arabia from its annual list of shame. The UN Children in Armed Conflict report, which documents the UN verified grave violations against children in conflict zones over 2019, failed to hold the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition to account for killing and injuring children, including breaches of humanitarian law, which had been verified. This follows a dangerous pattern since 2016, as Fatima noted in her opening comments, by the previous Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, when he admitted that he would not list the Saudi and Emirati coalition due to political pressure. The decision to list warring parties in the report should be free from political pressure or considerations, including permanent members of the UN Security Council or countries with powerful friends. It should be based on one consideration only. Does the UN have verified data showing a pattern of grave violations against children's rights? In the case of the Saudi and Emirati coalition, the answer is clearly yes. Save the Children was also concerned that the report delisted the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, who have been found to have killed and maimed children and committed sexual violence against children. The report has the potential to be a powerful incentive for parties to negotiate with the UN and implement actions to address violations against children. However, it loses all credibility when double standards are applied. Save the Children has been calling for an independent assessment on how the UN Secretary General has implemented the listing and delisting criteria. And secondly, for the UN to implement a robust due diligence system. Going forward, the annexes for the report must accurately and consistently reflect the evidence collected and verified by the UN's monitoring and reporting mechanism in line with long-established criteria and identified in General Assembly resolutions. Save the Children has engaged in public advocacy, privately and publicly, to bring attention to the failures with the UN Secretary General's report. We've expressed our strong disappointment, supporting joint letters with over 25 NGOs sent to the UN Secretary General on the 22nd of June. In Australia, following the report's release, we issued a media release and have brought attention to the issue publicly, writing to the Australian Foreign Minister, together with other NGOs such as Watchlist, World Vision, the Medical Association for Prevention of War, and many more. Save the Children is also looking ahead towards actions to continue attention to outline the problems and systemic issues with the reporting process. For example, Niger is planning a UN Security Council briefing on attacks on education, which may give again an opportunity to give rise to these concerns in the coming months. Beyond the UN Children in Armed Conflict report, there are three thematic policy and advocacy priorities I wanted to discuss, including the pledging support for the humanitarian crisis, defence exports transparency, and Magnitsky Act sanctions reforms. And I'll speak to these with a little bit more of an Australian-centred lens. On the 2nd of June, 2020, the international community came together for a virtual pledging conference to support the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Disappointingly, this year's pledging conference raised $1.35 billion. That was just half the amount that was pledged at last year's conference of $2.6 billion. The conference was a crucial opportunity to ensure that life-saving aid would continue to reach the Yemeni population. It was extremely disappointing to see that individual donors, with the exception of very few governments, failed to equal last year's pledges, given the desperate circumstances at this point in time. The largest single sum pledged came from Saudi Arabia, US $500 million, the main protagonist in the war and the cause of so much suffering in Yemen. Yet only 300 million of that will be channeled to the humanitarian appeal. 200 million of the amount that they're pledging will be directly implemented by Saudi organisations. Meanwhile, the UAE pledged nothing, claiming responsibility for the damage that they have caused. Other big donors, such as the UK, the US, Norway, and Germany, provided funds. One of the most notable increases was the additional funds provided by South Korea, who increased their contribution from US 4 million to US 18.5 million. Australia, meanwhile, last year pledged 7.2 million. This year pledged nothing, which was incredibly disappointing. The European Union, again, reduced less than half of their pledging amount this year. Save the Children is continuing to call upon foreign governments and donors to pledge more money. With respect to defence exports transparency, Save the Children is particularly concerned about the lack of transparency towards defence exports to members of the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition. In July 2017, the Australian government announced its ambition to become a top 10 defence exporter by 2028 and has since been rolling out a new defence export strategy, the goal being to achieve greater export success to build a stronger and more sustainable Australian defence industry. Between now and 2028, Australia intends to spend 200 million Australian dollars on research, development, manufacturing and export of weapons. The priority market for these weapons will be the Middle East. In addition, the Australian Defence Export Office has established a dedicated mechanism for export finances within Export Finance Australia to refer defence export business applications for finance worth up to Australian $3.8 billion. Documents that civil society organisations have obtained under freedom of information laws and provided in response to parliamentary questions have revealed that Australia has authorised 40 permits for the transfer of defence goods, including weapons components to the UAE and Saudi Arabia from 2015 to 2019. To date, the Australian government has refused to disclose specific details of its military exports to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, including the types of weapons exported or details on how the Defence Department conducted the risk assessment for each permit, demonstrating a deeply concerning level of lack of transparency. The government has refused to provide guarantees that Australia's military exports are not being sold in violation of international humanitarian law. This is the fact that despite the defence material is being sold directly to warring parties who have committed war crimes. Save the Children is concerned that Australia's current defence export regime is substantially less transparent than other like-minded countries, whether it's Germany, Netherlands, France, or others. Australia lags significantly behind in relation to reporting on arms export licences, providing mechanisms for parliamentary and public scrutiny, and the public knowledge of licensing processes. Save the Children will be undertaking more advocacy in this space and is calling on the Australian government to significantly step up its investments. And when it significantly steps up its investments in strategic defence material to correspondingly increase legislative and policy reform in this space. Yemen will be particularly front and centre of our minds in this advocacy work. With respect to Magnitsky sanctions reforms, Save the Children is also undertaking advocacy to ensure that perpetrators of violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law can be held accountable. Children are the most vulnerable when it comes to conflict environments in situations of mass displacement or in authoritarian states where fundamental rights are under threat. Yemen is just one such example where the deliberate campaigns of violence are being undertaken against children. At present, perpetrators of violations of child rights in Yemen, whether they're located in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, have little reason to fear in being held accountable for their actions. Most do not face any real political, economic, or legal consequences for their behaviour. Save the Children is calling on Magnitsky-style legislation for Australia, following the US, UK, Canada, and other states. Australia remains an attractive destination for human rights violators and corrupt officials to store their wealth. And while we do not have the same amount of capital from Saudi Arabia and the UAE as the UK does, the cumulative effect of Magnitsky sanctions, if acted upon in concert with like-minded governments, would be extremely effective. In the Australian Parliament right now, the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade is currently holding an inquiry into whether Australia should use targeted sanctions to address human rights abuses, including the introduction of Magnitsky-style laws. While Australia does have an existing sanctions regime, it is not fit for purpose and lacks mandated civil society engagement in comparison to US laws. It also does not specifically target violations of international humanitarian law. Save the Children has made 2 submissions to this inquiry. I've also appeared before the parliamentary hearing in this process. In each of these submissions and hearings, we've used Yemen as a specific example to illustrate the need for such laws. And I anticipate by the end of 2020, we will see legislative reform in this space in Australia. Save the Children considers that there is a great deal of complementarity between defence exports transparency and Magnitsky sanctions. After being criticised for the arms license exports to the Saudi coalition, as Andrew illustrated, the UK government did impose sanctions on Saudis, albeit not as expansive as Save the Children would have liked. The Arms Trade Treaty and the Magnitsky sanctions are complementary and should not compensate for each other. For all states, in deciding how they should promote human rights abroad, there'll be a range of tools at their disposal, whether they can engage multilaterally through the UN Security Council or bilaterally through human rights dialogues. Each response will ultimately have its own limitation, but for engagement to be strategic and effective, it must be coupled with flexible and targeted measures, which Magnitsky-style laws provide. That gives the ability to easily go after that general who ordered the airstrike on the school, which killed 4 children, or the transport company, which is assisting with transporting weapons into Yemen. So, concluding, Save the Children globally remains deeply concerned with the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Yemen. The failure of the international community to respond adequately remains a stain on our international consciousness. Unfortunately, without any sign of in the end of the conflict in sight, it is important to ensure that preventative measures are put in place by the international community to minimise death and destruction that a generation of children are currently facing. There are real and substantive measures that can be taken. Today, I've just outlined 3 such examples: increasing pledges in response to the crisis, implementing defence exports, transparency reform, and instituting Magnitsky-style law reforms, or utilising existing Magnitsky sanctions laws. The international community owes it to the children of Yemen to do everything it can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for your informative presentation. And thank you all, Sam, Andrew, and Simon, for joining us tonight. It depends on your time zone on this panel. I want just to conclude by emphasizing that the Gulf Institute for Democracy and Human Rights, as all the other human rights organizations around the world, call on the international community to pressure all the warring parties, especially Saudi Arabia and the coalition, as they are the main parties who are dropping bombs and bombing the residential neighborhoods, hospitals, and schools, to stop the war in Yemen and stop targeting the children, as children should not be under any circumstances part or a target for armed conflicts, to pressure Saudi-led coalition to allow for humanitarian aids to reach their destinations, especially aids related to food, medications, and immunizations, and stop arming Saudi Arabia and its allies, as these arms are used to target civilians, including children and women in Yemen and even in their own countries. I would like to ask my guests if they have any final comments. Sam? Yes, Andrew?
Yeah, I feel it's been a really good discussion. I find Simon's contribution really interesting, as well as Sam's, and I'm very grateful for you hosting us. I think that we have to also be looking to the future, because thinking about specifically the role of UK weapons, we had Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, visited London in 2018, and while he was there, he got all the trappings of a state visit. He had lunch with the Queen, he had dinner with Prince Charles, he had his photo taken on the steps of Downing Street. But when he flew out, it was announced that Britain and Saudi Arabia had moved one step closer to securing a new fighter jet deal. And it occurs to me that many of the fighter jets, many of the bombs which are being used in Yemen now were sold years and years ago. The cluster bombs which Saudi forces used, which they initially denied using for a long time until they were forced to admit that they had in fact used them, after a report by Amnesty International, those had been sold in the 1980s and were still being used 20 years later. And it really emphasises that the lifespan of a weapon is much longer than the lifespan of the political situation it's sold into. And many of the arms sales which are happening now will not just be used in Yemen, they could be used in the next atrocity, the next abuse, the next war. And there's a really important long-term point there that we could well be sowing the seeds of further tragedy and further atrocities for years and years to come with this terrible industry and with terrible decisions which are being made by very powerful people today.
Exactly, Andrew. Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and hope we can collaborate later on a more happier occasion. Thank you.
Thank you very much.